Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all safe and well, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Safa Lukili. I'm the Events Director of the Oxford Climate Society and a Master's student in Environmental Management here at Oxford. The Oxford Climate Society is a student society at the University of Oxford that aims to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to our speaker events, we run educational programs throughout the year, including our award-winning School of Climate Change, which taught over 1,500 people from all over the world last term. We also run the world's largest student-led climate journal, The Anthroposphere, and are currently working with the university to incorporate climate in the Oxford curriculum. Today's event will address the role of religious ethics in environmental management and the potential of religion to serve as a mobilizing force for environmental preservation and climate action. On June 18, 2014, Pope Francis released the encyclical letter Laudato Si on care for our common home, in which he proposed an integral approach to ecology, economics, and equity for the well-being of both people and the planet. As head of the largest religious organization in the world, his statement was particularly significant in highlighting and emphasizing the role of religion in providing the ethical norms to reform humans' approach to nature for a sustainable future marked by respect, moderation, and harmony, values that are shared by many world religions. In the past decades, faith-based organizations, initiatives, and coalitions have also taken on the mission of mobilizing faith communities for the protection of the environment by building capacity within the communities, providing training to religious leaders, but also facilitating interfaith dialogue on this issue. Governments also, from Qatar to Indonesia to China, have attempted to integrate religious precepts and their traditions in their sustainability awareness building campaign to personalize issues such as water conservation, biodiversity loss, or climate action. And as it inspired and supported previous social movements from national independence struggles to civil rights movements in the United States, religions are again called upon to enable greater cooperation by tapping into the trust, sense of belonging, and social capital integral and present within faith communities. However, this movement can also suffer from certain challenges, including the fact that belief systems can also run counter to environmental protection or climate action by sustaining and reproducing fatalistic narratives which complicate climate change adaptation, or science denying attitudes which reject the critical nature of climate change, environmental problems, or the role of humans in addressing these issues. And so to discuss these synergies and challenges, we are delighted to welcome Reverend Fletcher Harper, Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker, and Professor Anna Gade. Fletcher is the Executive Director of Green Faith, an interfaith coalition for the environment. A pioneer of the global religious environmental movement, he helps spearhead the faith-based fossil fuel divestment movement, organizes faith turnouts at major climate mobilizations, and he is also the author of Green Faith, Mobilizing God's People to Protect the Earth. Dr. Tucker, Mary Evelyn, is a senior lecturer and research scholar at Yale University, where she directs the Forum on Religion and Ecology, and she is the author of numerous books on Asian religions and ecology, including Hinduism and Ecology, the intersection of earth, sky, and water, and Buddhism and Ecology, the intersection of dharma and deeds. Professor Anna Gade is a scholar of Islam, religion, Southeast Asia, and environmental studies in the Gaylord Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she is the author of Muslim Environmentalism, Religious and Social Foundations. And so to outline the event, we will first hear a 15-minute presentation from each of our speakers. This will be followed by questions from myself, and finally a Q&A session open to the audience. And so if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box throughout the event. A member of our team is moderating the chat, and we will make sure to raise them to the speakers. And so to start the event, I will now hand over to Mary Evelyn. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Safa, and your whole team for organizing this and for all the work you're doing at Oxford. It's terrific. And I want to pick up on some of your last comments there, that we know religions have their problems and their promise. There's very clear throughout history and certainly at present. So we want to acknowledge that from the very beginning. This is not an easy answer to very complex environmental problems, but it is raising up why the ethical moral force matters in terms of the science and policy and law and technology and economics. All those are necessary, but perhaps not sufficient without the moral force of religions. And we know that there's a billion Muslims, there's a billion Confucians and more, there's a billion Hindus, 2 billion Christians, et cetera. So this force is rising. And that's what I think we're going to illustrate today. It was 25 years ago this month, in June actually, that we began some conferences at Harvard with Buddhism and ecology and Confucianism and ecology. And we did a series, John Grimm, my husband and myself, and hundreds of other scholars on the world's religions and ecology to examine what's the potential here for every possible tradition, including indigenous traditions, the Asian traditions, and the Western traditions. And then we did a 10-volume edited series from Harvard. And we were building on others who had already said, like John Cobb, is it too late? Some theologians who were concerned even in the 1970s about this issue. But it did begin, it helped to initiate, I would say, a field of within academia that could take this seriously. And as Harvard began to, other universities certainly did as well. And Gus Beth, a great environmentalist, brought us to Yale saying he felt that science and policy wasn't enough and that we needed these values and other approaches. But in addition to this academic field, thinking through what are the theologies, what are the traditions, what are the scriptures, and how can this be transformed, retrieved, reevaluated, and reconstructed in light of contemporary circumstances. But in addition to all this academic work, very careful scholarship, the force that Fletcher Harper in particular will represent on this panel is something we've been very, very concerned with as well. And on our Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology website, we have engaged projects from all the world's religions that represent this grassroots religious environmentalism. So a field and a force. And I'd like to illustrate some of this from a few of the Asian traditions. I'm just going to be brief about Hinduism and Buddhism, and I'll be a little more elaborate about Confucianism because that's my own area of study. But I want to highlight 2 extraordinary activists from Hinduism and from Buddhism. The first is Sunderland Bahaguna, who just passed away on May 21st of this year from COVID in his late 90s. Now, Bahaguna should be a household word for all of us, but he was one of the people with his wife who began the Chipko movement of hugging trees through the Himalaya mountains that were being deforested. And he also did a 5,000 kilometer march through the Himalayas to activate villagers along these lines. Throughout his whole life, he was inspired by Gandhi, by nonviolence, by satyagraha, by these great moral forces. He was one of the great activists against the huge dams, the Terry Dam in particular, and so on. One of his most famous sayings is, ecology is permanent economy. So as you preserve the environment, you have a regenerative economy. And that was one of the key mottos of the Chipko movement. I could go on and on about him, but I just want to draw him in at this moment and give the memory of this extraordinary person and his wife a high profile for all of us to return to over the years ahead. The other person in Buddhism I want to highlight is Tiknot Han, who is one of the great leaders of engaged Buddhism. He was ordained at a very young age in Vietnam, at age 16, in fact. And he was born in 1920, 6, so he's 94 years old now and has suffered a stroke, but is still living with great dignity and force back in Vietnam. He came to the United States to teach at Princeton in 66 and 60 and 61, Princeton and then Columbia, and he came back in 66 and he met Martin Luther King, who nominated him for the Nobel Peace Prize. And he was eventually, though, in those late 60s, not permitted to return to Vietnam because he had been opposing the war, and yet with his engaged Buddhism, he became a tremendous peace activist and a social justice activist. One of these people who could help us to see the enemy and the peacemakers are one. And he developed, as many of us know, this tremendous idea of interbeing, the coming out of Buddhist teachings of interdependence, interrelationality. He's written literally 100 books, and he started in the 80s, Plum Village in France, where hundreds of people have learned mindfulness meditation. There's over 200 monks and nuns there now. So he's one of the great people in engaged Buddhism. And again, we want to highlight that as an important movement in Asia, but also in the United States and in Europe, engaged Buddhism for the environment and for peace and for justice. Now, if we could also talk about the Dalai Lama. We don't want to forget him as a major leader, one of the very early ones on environment and Buddhism. But because he's better known, I'm going to move on to Confucianism, which is not as well known. And yet Confucianism, 5,000-year-old tradition, has probably influenced more people than any other tradition in certain ways on the planet, just because of its longevity and because the numbers of people in the population of China over many years. And yet it's a tradition that's not well known because the texts have not been as much translated as those of Hinduism and Buddhism, for example. It took me 25 years to finish one translation about 10 years ago. So there's a bit of a language curtain around East Asia, of China, Korea, Japan, which are the key countries of East Asia, deeply influenced by Confucianism. But let me just say a few things as to why this tradition is so important and why it has powerful resources, said with respect for the problem and promise, but the amazing sense, I'll just give a few key points, of beginning with a comprehensive cosmology. And this cosmology is universe, earth, and human as one continuous process. There's not radical transcendence in this tradition, but there's what's called the continuity of being, that we are part of this whole unfolding process, which is what evolution is telling us. And when we showed our film, Journey of the Universe in China, a year and a half ago, 77,000 people watched it because they could see the Confucian cosmology in it as well. And Confucian scholars responded to it. So there's a compatibility with modern cosmology and modern science. So then the next point I'd like to underscore is there's a non-dualism in Confucianism of matter spirit, which is qi. Many of you know qigong, tai chi, and so on. Cultivating qi is one of the most ancient practices of both Confucianism and Taoism, of course. And I should mention Taoism has many resources too, but and these are complementary traditions. But qi is present in all things, in the air, the sky, the water, plants, flowers, trees, humans, and in the universe itself. So this is a fabulous and powerful notion of non-dualism that is a vital force in all of nature. Something that's being tried to be recovered, in fact, in the West, which has a pretty radical dualism of matter and spirit, matter and energy. The other non-dualistic position in Confucianism is mind and heart, thinking and feeling are one. The word in Japanese is kokoro, in Chinese it's shin. So the thinking, feeling component of the universe is the human. And in this tradition, the human is the one that completes heaven and earth, the universe and nature itself, and becomes a co-creator with this process as one aligns with these powerful fecund forces of transformation of nature and universe. So finally, the Confucian tradition has this sense of not hyper-individualism, which is causing some radical problems in our Western modern contemporary moment, but it's committed to communitarianism. It's committed to this notion that the self is not isolated, but is part of concentric circles. So it's self, family, society, the educational world, the natural world, the political world, and the universe itself. And as one cultivates oneself, which is part of education, it's moral cultivation and intellectual cultivation all together. As one cultivates oneself, one affects these other circles, so that even the ruler has got to be moral and bring a sense of a common good to the polity, to the political sphere. Now, let me just say, by way of conclusion, that these ideas are actually operative in China today. And we are talking about over 1 billion people. Now, I'm not saying everyone is Confucian concerned and so on, but Confucianism is the cultural DNA of East Asia. It's what keeps these social relations going, family relations going, and so on. And I should mention, most of these traditions are not necessarily hugely valuing women, so we need to acknowledge that. But the relationships are reciprocal in principle. Now, I want to just touch on a couple things. One is the revival of Confucianism in China in the educational system after it was almost destroyed by Mao. It's being revived, reading of the classics. A popular Confucianism is appearing. One book by Yu Dan, a professor, sold 10 million copies. It's also being revived by the government in what's called Ecological Civilization. It's in the Constitution. The Minister of Education has been working on this, as has the Minister of the Environment. So I see Fletcher here, and I think I'm going to pass it off to him in just a moment. But I just want to highlight my teacher at Columbia, Professor Ted DeBerry, who's passed away, Dewey Ming. These two, Dewey Ming is at the Institute for Humanistic Studies at Beijing University. They have been helping to revive Confucianism as well. We can talk more about this in the discussion. But thank you for listening. And back to you, Safa, and then to Fletcher.
Thank you so much for everything. I think it's fascinating because I think Confucianism, when we think about it, especially from the West, is very much the sense of filiality. We just think about, the rule and the people, the parents and the child, the wife and the husband kind of relationship, not so much with the nature, and to see that kind of extended to nature and that sense of we have different layers of yourself, and then your family, and then the society, and then the environment, and then the universe. It's really interesting to think about it that way. So we'll come back to this in the Q&A session, obviously. If it's okay, we'll go now to Anna. Yes, please go ahead, Anna.
Thank you so much for that, Safa. Hi, everybody. First off, I want to say thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this important conversation. And I acknowledge that I'm speaking to you on the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people here at UW-Madison. And I think Luke is going to help me out by dropping some links in the YouTube feed there. So this is where I am at the Nelson Institute, and I'm honored to be here with these distinguished panelists. Wondering a little bit if we could have represented a more diverse group nationally and racially, but next time we'll do even better. I want to say a heartfelt thank you to the Oxford Climate Society for this invitation and for convening a critical discussion. So thanks to new friends, Safa and Luke, and for opening this up to the world. When I started to write the book, Muslim Environmentalisms, and here, since I'm going to mention it, is the link to it. It's going to be a little bit delayed for you folks there at home. I considered the project to be fairly straightforward, even with the complicating S that's on the end there. drawing on fieldwork and religious responses to environmental change in the world's most populous Muslim majority country, that is Indonesia. And I did some videography there that you can take a look at some point if you want to. And also taking into account the whole spectrum of shared resources about the environment and global Islamic tradition, I expected that I could translate Muslim experience pretty directly into the language of fields like religion and ecology, which, as Mary Evelyn said, had its start largely with that project at Harvard. Islamic studies and fields of environmental humanities, including, of course, religious studies, which is my own field of doctoral expertise. It probably won't surprise you to hear that the project was more challenging than I had anticipated. And what was hard wasn't locating the environmentalisms within Muslim life worlds of the past, the present, or future imaginings. Instead, the concepts and the expectations, even for ecological sciences and environmental activism, couldn't accommodate Islam so well. So coming out of this perspective, my brief remarks today will be both critical and constructive. I suppose you could say they represent synergies and challenges, or synergies and tensions, true to our advertising today. Before we can all really talk about how Islam and Muslims fit into shared frameworks, including those to mobilize interfaith activism and the manipulation of registers of authority and sentiment, like environmental care and awareness and concern and so forth, that this would require, I think it's essential to take a step back to think about how to decolonize these very agendas from their historical inheritances. Can we do better? So in this presentation, if you notice, I'm just going to drop links in the chat, like footnotes. So they'll have some specifics in them. You know, we're all staring at boxes on the screen here anyway. So I hope that'll give you some more flexibility than a big PowerPoint presentation that takes up all the space. If you want to, just go ahead and shut your eyes and you get a 10-minute podcast. One of the organizing principles then of this book, Muslim Environmentalisms, is the relationship between two things. One, projects that attempt to enroll religion for the sake of environmental goals on the one hand, and on the other hand, two, those that would engage environmental practice for the sake of religious goals on the other hand. Examples of the first would include initiatives on the part of NGOs, like in the field of conservation, that seek religious norms and practices, like the 5 pillars of Islam. Here's a good example. The first one is out of the UK with the ARC, and the second is from here in America with ISNA on Green Hajj and Green Ramadan, respectively. And these support environmental initiatives. Examples of the latter, the second mode, that is environment for the sake of religion, would include teachings I heard firsthand that sounded a little bit Sufi at times in Indonesia, and solidly grounded in Quran and Hadith, like teachings about how to attain the mercy of Allah in the world to come by practicing mercy with God's creation in this world. And on the link from Vimeo that's up there, Kiai Haji Tontawi has an incredible kind of mind-blowing teaching about that. You can see on your own if you want. He had to start actually with WWF on Bali. The trick with presenting this whole array of environmentalisms, from those that may be actively promoted by non-Muslims for Muslims, like a famous fatwa on wildlife conservation sponsored by the WWF, there's a lot written on that, to teachings and practices that are so organic that they can slip past analysis as normative practice if intention or Islamic tradition isn't clearly known. The trick, I think, is to let go of charting any degree of authenticity. And with this, I'm just saying old habits die hard when it comes to Orientalism. These discourses all intersect, they intertwine, they express the hybridity of the modern, and none is more authentic than another. These are critical global environmental ideas, all that are in circulation. In fact, what's more interesting to me now being in the field of environmental studies proper is what they say about whatever is going to be construed as environment, right? Like, is climate different from other environmental problems? So there is a critique, though, that I think is here, which is how standard development critique would apply to some of the initiatives of the first type. And there's a lot in my book about development critique and how that applies to things like UNDP and sustainability goals, but I'm going to skip over that because the theme to which I want to devote the remainder of my brief time here is a matter of constructive and not just critical approach. Now, I guess this needs to be said. No one, Muslim or not, can legitimately claim to speak for 1.6 billion living people. And I'm no theologian in any case. But my research does consider the system that originated much of what are today's environmental sciences in its own empirical tradition, and analyzes some emergent patterns in Muslim religious ecological thought and practice. And thus, naturally, it offers some analytical ideas. That's the whole exercise, actually. And I think these reframe humanistically what is meant by the environment in critical respects. So there's a lot to report on and explain really wonderful things that Muslim communities are doing, for example, with organic farming and social justice. Those are just a couple of links from EdgeEffects, the blog here at UW-Madison. I just want to make two broader points here about how an Islamic and in fact a religious worldview recasts critically and constructively the ground from which we think through what is environmentalism, including with respect to standard operating definitions like crisis, problems, nature, and so forth. An idea coming out of the whole analysis of Muslim materials, a generalization now, not an essentialism, is that Muslim environmentalisms can be viewed in terms of consequential relations. So Luke, that's the term that maybe you could just drop in the chat because I say it really fast, I know. It's an idea that I want to explore further in work in religious ethics. But for today, it indicates that diverse Muslim perspectives can shift the ground in Anglophone environmental thinking and activism. No longer a nature concept we're working with, or no longer even possibly an array of world religions. So now please let me offer just some points about what I think a frame of consequential relations, come up with your own, could mean for our main topic today, about mobilizing diverse faith groups around climate and other issues. First, consequential relations are consequential, not a kind of environmental ethics like Donna Haraway's muddling through. They make a connection of law and ethics, and that point is actually an old chestnut in Islamic studies, but also one that I think Anglophone notions like rights of nature still struggles with. Any committed Islamic religious perspective coming from whatever orientation will affirm the truth claims of the Quran. That's what it is to be religious. About a fifth of that text presents apocalyptic scenarios. So any Muslim environmentalism accepts the reality of Earth's destruction. And this imminent eschatology is presented throughout the Quran, vividly, repeatedly, dynamically, demonstrating that this world undergoes a process of environmental transformation into the world to come. And with this reckoning of future consequence, the present action on and toward this earth is indexed with respect to clear promise and warning in personal, communal, and multi-generational registers. And I have a lot to say about what this means in terms of how people conceptualize Islamic law, including these secular organizations, and how this motivates individual activists. But I want to move on to what this might mean for our shared conversation here. Related Islamic theory and practice around the Quranic imperative to stand up for justice against this horizon of ultimate consequence represents a fundamental mode to think through what's really meant by environmental justice, or EJ, in a global and inclusive sense. This includes struggles against environmental racism, as in the history of EJ in the USA, and other matters of post-coloniality and political ecology that go beyond individualized moral sentiments and personalized practices of ecological virtue as solutions to problems, like are expressed in key Quranic words like oppression and corruption, and to attend to the marginalized. Like indigenous systems, Islamic understandings of environmental law and ethics, furthermore, carry forward into the scales of the unseen, the unknown, the indeterminate that are essential even to begin to start to think about the material and ethical issues posed by climate realities. Any religious perspective can do this, arguably, but the Islamic tradition of EJ has already been articulating clear jurisprudential norms and practices that could be called environmental law within this field for a long time, and water law is a classic example. Second, consequential relations emphasize the horizons of pluralistic and multi-species relations. It's kind of fashionable now in my fields of environmental humanities to define environment not as problems to solve or a nature concept, but instead as systems of relations. And contemporary Muslim ecological thinkers like Sara Tlili demonstrate on a Quranic basis the central distinction to be made is not between humans and nature, like Syed Hossein Nasr once posed, but rather creator with respect to the creation. This puts all of creation on the same side of the ontological divide, and also maybe challenges the idea that anthropocentrism is the key problem of environmental ethics. Moreover, creation also includes not just the non-human, but the non-sentient. The Quran depicts mountains and even the earth itself coming alive to speak, to tell its own story on the Day of Judgment, for example. Now, I have some questions about how cosmologies work as ethics, but to me, tangibly, what this means is that within the system, environmental resources are also creatures. The bee, like on the cover of the book, receives God's inspiration directly. To include such a principle of genuine pluralism, even beyond biodiversity, should recast our conversation to become one that requires not just interfaith acknowledgement, as in lita'arafu in Surat al-Hujurat of the Quran, but multi-species perspectives. That is, relations with consequences. So to sum up, just an idea, consequential relations. It's a way to hold together all of this diverse material. It means consequences and relations. And I guess instead of a message for Muslims to mobilize around, this is more of a suggestion for all of us from the study of Islam for how we might move forward together. I think even old 20th century notions of unthinkable crisis, like living with a bomb, are worn out in important respects, leaving us staring into the edge of an existential abyss. And rather than going on, keeping on, we must go on beyond hope toward a real calculation of the consequences of historical and structural relations. While secular perspectives wouldn't affirm a Quranic or even a religious worldview, although sometimes I'm not so sure about the nature concept, questions like climate disaster put the conversation into a no analog register for which Muslims, maybe ironically, maybe already have a rather well-developed vocabulary to lead a shared discussion about what comes next against unprecedented horizons of consequence. And God knows best. Thank you very much. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say.
Thank you so much, Anna, for your contribution. I think a recurrent theme in both your presentation and Mary Evelyn's presentation is the idea of reconceptualizing and kind of discovering our traditions in light of current challenges. So on this note, I'll pass it to Fletcher for his presentation.
Thanks so much, Safa, and wonderful to see Mary Evelyn and to hear and learn from her as I've done for many years, and wonderful to learn from Anna also. So unlike our two prior speakers, I am not academically qualified whatsoever. I'm a religious environmental activist and have been so for 20 years or so. And so what I'm going to do is I'll start with a story and talk a little bit about what this work looks like from that perspective. I'm just back from northern Minnesota in the United States, where there was, over the last several days, a massive demonstration against a huge proposed new pipeline called Line 3, which a Canadian multinational called Enbridge wants to run from the Alberta tar sands down to a port on the Great Lakes of the United States so that they can get their dirty oil to market. The pipeline would carry oil that would create greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to 45 new coal-fired power plants. So it is exactly the kind of project that should not be happening at this point. And yet here we are with a president in the United States who's certainly a lot better than the prior alternative, but still faced with these choices that we shouldn't have to face. The science has been settled for decades on this, thanks to Mary Evelyn's work and subsequent work by scholars like Anna. The moral case has been, to be honest, really, really simply clear for decades. I mean, this is not rocket science. From our perspective, this is a question of sort of cultural and political and economic power. So we got to Minnesota, and got up on the morning of the mobilization on the way to the site where we were having we had about 350 people of faith that we'd organized to come to the mobilization. And you'll hear echoes of what both Mary Evelyn and Anna said in these concrete examples I'm going to share. So we're on the way to the place where we were gathering to have an interfaith prayer circle led by Indigenous leaders and with multi-faith participation. Activists had blockaded one of the entry points to the pipeline construction site with a massive sign that said relatives, not resources. And so right there, you start to get the direct physical confrontation of a destructive project that is part of what we're realizing is necessary if we're going to avert the kind of destructive impacts of climate change that are in the making. And also a direct confrontation of worldviews that is also what's at stake. It was a spectacular sign. You're driving through sort of wild rice fields in northern Minnesota, and it's all green and lush, and then you see a big dirt road cut in, you see massive pipeline segments, and you see this sign right in front of it. We got to the demonstration site. We had a really compelling multi-faith sort of time of prayer and of sharing, led by Indigenous women who spoke with an authority. I have found consistently in the work that I've done that it is Indigenous and First Nations leaders who speak with the deepest kind of authority, morally and spiritually and religiously, that's out there, because from their culture and their life ways, as Mary Evelyn's husband John has sort of coined a phrase, they can say very authentically that the natural world is our kin. And they can say that in a way that just very simply does not roll off the tongues naturally of Christians and Jews and Muslims. Sometimes in the Hindu community, I would say, of the major sort of quote unquote world religions, you'll hear it sometimes in a Buddhist context, but by and large not elsewise, despite the fact that these traditions are overflowing with references in sacred writings and spiritual traditions. But there's a sort of embodied way of speaking about this that Indigenous communities have that is of irreplaceable significance spiritually and morally to every religious tradition on the planet at this point. Because when we lose that Indigenous witness, we lose that lived understanding of what's at stake and what these relations are in a way that's different than most other religions conceive of them as being. We walked over and joined into a march along a highway towards one of the sites where the pipeline was going to cross the Mississippi River. And what was striking there was that we were 350 people of faith among a mobilization of 2,500 people or so. The signage that the supposedly secular or non-religious activists carried was more full of spiritual and moral language than most religious sermons are. Sacred water, sacred land, sacred air. And that raises the specter of this really interesting conundrum that the world is facing with this crisis right now. And I'll talk more about some of the organized religious dimensions of this in a minute, but we're facing a situation that is clearly moral in nature and deeply spiritual in nature. And it is Indigenous and secular activists that are finding some of the most compelling language and energy to speak to this and to resist the destruction. And they're doing so oftentimes with, from my perspective, an understandable sense that organized religious groups are late to the game and are a little bit weak tea on this whole thing. So I think that's something that's just important to acknowledge and to look at. Religious texts are, in most traditions, pretty good at recognizing that religious infrastructures are very often corrupted or not up to the task. And I think that we're seeing a sort of, some of that play out. And I say that not to bash religious institutions, but to be real about what's needed and about what's going on and about the challenge and the opportunity that that offers to religious institutions. So, the mobilization got really good press coverage. Hopefully that helps as part of shifting the sort of culture and the political calculations that President Biden has to make about whether he's going to step up and do what he's already done with the Keystone XL pipeline, which is to cancel one pipeline that would carry 800,000 gallons of tar sands oil a day to market, and decide if he's going to do that with another, or if he's going to make some sort of political calculation that the logic of which is difficult to discern, that would say, okay, I'll say no in one case, and then in an almost identical case, say yes. We were driving back and we saw a United Methodist Church in the town of Park Rapids, right close by. And they had two signs out front that seemed irreconcilable. One was a sign proudly proclaiming that they were, I can't remember what the Methodist version of it is, they had a creation caretakers team. And the second sign was a sign in support of line 3. So either the congregation is at a pitched battle within itself, or they have managed to do a mental kind of gymnastics that convinces them that they can truly be pro-environment while also being in support of this pipeline. So when Green Faith does an analysis of what's really, what are the forces that we're working with here, we see three fundamental forces at play. You've got an extractive, exploitive, ultimately destructive economy and various forces in that. And the most obvious villains there are the fossil fuel sector and the industrial agriculture deforestation sectors, which together are responsible for an enormous share of the climate destruction and related human rights violations that are going on. The second center of power is either ineffective or repressive or authoritarian governments, which very simply, despite an overload of information to the contrary, have by and large failed to step up and do what's needed, and therefore we're on the course that we're on. Those two centers of power get talked about quite a lot, frankly, for good reasons. They're important, and I'm Christian, and St. Paul in the Bible writes about being up against the principalities and the powers, and I've got no doubt that if he was writing today, he would say that we're up against the multinational corporations and ineffective or authoritarian governments, because those are major principalities and powers at this point. The third thing that we're up against from our perspective is extremist and fundamentalist expressions of religion and cultural forces, related cultural forces. I don't need to tell this audience, because you've witnessed it from across the pond, that the power of right-wing Christianity in the United States has been in full view for the last 20 years for lots of us, and certainly for the last 4 years, where the derision that branch of Christianity holds for the protection of the earth is abundantly clear. We see similar forces in Brazil, where the evangelical bench is perspective towards the Amazon seems to be burn, baby, burn, and to open that up. But we also see, for example, the Hindutva forces in India eroding the rights of environmental protectors, while at the same time sort of in full bore attack against multi-faith collaboration and religious freedom. And you see expressions of this in the Arab Gulf states, which I know is an enormously uncomfortable topic for Muslims to engage, but we have to raise it. I mean, the fact that you've got Muslim majority countries that are wedded to an extractive economy that is going to destroy the planet in a livable sense in many ways if it doesn't change dramatically. These are incredibly painful and controversial issues, and there are religious roots to absolutely all of them. And I think that one of the shortcomings of the religious environmental movement, partly because we may not have felt powerful enough yet, has been that we've failed to call that out really directly, to say, as Mary Evelyn referred to at the beginning of her remarks, that religion is a huge part of the problem. And we're in a world now where, again, from our activist sort of stance, we see that kind of problematic and destructive expression of religion. And then the bulk of the response being from non-religious secular activists who in many cases desperately want a stronger religious response, but haven't seen enough yet. And I think that, part of what we exist to do is to try to speak to those people, those religious and spiritual people, and those people who consider themselves spiritual but not religious, and to say that it is absolutely against our religious and spiritual beliefs to destroy the planet, and that that's what's going on. And I think it's an Irish saying, is this a private fight or can anybody get involved? And to say that if one is not at a deep level, at the deepest level of one's being, profoundly upset, despairing, enraged, befuddled by what is happening to the planet, then one is not awake as a human being. And that we are facing a cataclysmic set of circumstances, and that a collective response to protect life from the religious communities of the world needs to start to emerge and needs to get out onto the front lines, along with our activist allies who've been, and our indigenous allies who've been carrying the torch for 40 to 50 years. We saw religious groups and have seen them playing a really important role in the fossil fuel divestment movement, which started out seeming to the world like a Buddhist koan. These things sort of, how could you possibly divest from fossil fuels? The world will stop rotating if you do that. And now there are trillions of dollars of assets that have been divested. That movement has helped undermine the viability of the coal industry and will do so with the fossil fuel sector going forward. We've seen strong religious turnouts that we've been privileged to be part of at major climate mobilizations. And again, to one of those sort of, is this explicitly religious or not, earlier that I mentioned, when we were coordinating the organizing for the 2014 climate march in New York, we had about 30 different religious groups that had organizing tables. So, Methodist, Buddhist, Muslim, it was in New York in the US. So again, a predominantly Christian. So lots of Christian subgroups, but then Baha'i, Sikh, Jain, Jewish, lots of different religious tables, beautiful religious diversity. We got a phone call 3 weeks before the march from the leader of one of the largest atheist organizations in the United States saying, hey, you've got all these other groups. Why don't you have an atheist group? It was a really interesting moment. We were like, well, we didn't know you wanted to be part of this. Sure, come on in. The mere fact that an atheist group wanted to be part of this multi-faith space spoke to the fact that there is something deep that's going on with this that's way beyond the way that we normally use vocabulary to talk about the boundaries between the sacred and the atheist and the religious and the profane and all of that sort of stuff. A funny piece was that atheist, of course, begins with the letter A. And so when we added them into the drop-down menu, atheist came up above. We figured, all right, if we're going to do atheist, we'll put agnostic in too. And they came up just a few spots above evangelical and Catholic. I figured, all right, well, we'll take our lumps, but this is the openness that we say that we're about. So, I'm going to close by saying that I think that alongside the kind of scholarship that Mary Evelyn and Anna have talked about, which gives us the intellectual ability to understand the kind of transformations in worldview that have to happen, and the indispensability of that kind of scholarship, that alongside that, it is indispensable for religious groups to have a very clear choice put to them about which side they're on. This is not a time when, life is always full of gray areas, but I can tell you very clearly that when the International Energy Agency comes out, the conservative body that it is, and says there can be no new fossil fuel infrastructure, there are very clear areas around climate where there is no gray. You either do the right thing or you don't. And so religious groups have to start to step up and pressure banks and investor groups and fossil fuel companies and industrial agriculture companies and say to them, what you're doing is fundamentally immoral and wrong, and you need to stop. And we need that transition to happen fast. We need it to be done in a way that protects vulnerable communities, that invests in jobs for workers who are displaced, that ensures that they're not going to pay the price for the transition that the executives running their corporation should have made decades ago, and that there are moral foundations and clear parameters around what needs to happen in society, and that religious groups need to be starting to say, we need to welcome the tens of millions of people who've been forced off their homes by climate change, despite having contributed nothing to the problem. And we need developed countries and wealthy countries to be ready to welcome these refugees with open arms. No politician will say that. Religious groups darn well better start saying it at scale, or they simply can't lay claim to the beautiful heritages of which they are the custodians. So, I'll stop there. And thanks very much. And thanks to Mary Evelyn and to Anna for their inspiration.
Thank you so much, Fletcher. It's really interesting how you were talking about the fact that secular activists are using spiritual language, and that agnostic groups and atheist groups were willing or wanting to take part in your march. I was wondering, so it seems that the problems that we have today, they're very much linked to this idea of the promise of modernity, the promise of science, the promise of capitalism, and the prosperity that was going to bring that kind of idea of the beginning of the 19th century, just 18th century end of that. And maybe because now we see the results of that kind of dreamed future that did not come to be true, people are trying to reconnect with a sense that is beyond the material, beyond the pragmatic, beyond the scientific, this is true and this is wrong, and more with spirituality and their feelings. And that might be why people are connecting with that. I just have a question about the fact that you were also talking about the failure of organized religion, and the fact that they're very late to the party, let's say. So in our secular world, there seems to religious worship and religious groups are confined to private sphere. And so either through a process of secularization and the loss of relevance of religious groups and beliefs in day-to-day activities, let's say, or a top-down desire to neutralize the political potential of religious actors, depending on what context we are in. And so this creates an issue of legitimacy, maybe, that either the involvement of the religious communities in the matter of environmental management is seen as unwarranted because, they don't influence social attitudes only minimally, or they still hold significance in less secularized societies, but because of that significance, religious groups are co-opted and religious precepts are instrumentalized or utilized by secular actors without secular actors actually opening the door for a reconceptualization or questioning of our socioeconomic status quo, and without empowering the civil society and faith groups. And so I was wondering, how can we move from religious discourse being kind of reaffirming existing secular ideas, often that are counterproductive or against environmental protection. You were mentioning, for example, the GCC countries, and how in the GCC countries, they're using religious discourse for water conservation and sustainability and all that, but obviously that doesn't really fit into the wider view of what society and the economy in the region is. So how can we move from that to religion as affirming a truly different approach to nature? So that was my question. It's very long, I'm sorry. Whoever wants to start, give me their view. Yeah.
Mary Evelyn or Anna should go. I've just talked for a long time.
Yeah, but we love listening to you, Fletcher. I could listen to that all day. All right, I'll take a stab at that, Safa. That's a great question. I think I understand it. I hear it in terms of, what I was saying in my own talk, right? Which was in part about this thing about enrolling religious groups for environmental goals versus the religious thing. And, so you heard what I have to say about that, which is that I don't invest in deciding, making kind of a normative choice about what's better or more authentic around that. But, here's the thing I think that I hear in your question and I've heard in all of our presentations today in kind of different registers is that I have come to the conclusion, academically and also just being me, that the environment is an ethical category. And this comes actually from hanging out with a lot of scientists more than religious people, but I think so, and I think that that's a little bit different from the observation that so often, like in the field of religion and ecology, Mary Evelyn can speak more to this, that the environment is also often cast as a moral problem with a religious solution. I'm not talking in that mode. I'm talking about how we understand what is the environment itself beyond kind of a problem solution paradigm. So in that spirit, then, Safa, I guess in response to your question, I don't have an answer because I wouldn't ask that question, right? I've decided not to think kind of in those terms. And yet, I think that's absolutely the right question to have. And I'm even more convinced after listening to Fletcher tell his story. I do think that the environment is an ethical category, and to think through the environment, however we wish to define it, we must use a language that's like what, back in the day at Chicago, we would call religious ethics. So for what it's worth, thanks for asking.
And I would just jump in. It's a great question. It's very complicated. It's many questions in your question, Safa, really. But, let me just pick up where Anna left off. There's secular ethics for the environment, right? And Beard Callicott, one of the leaders of that, said years ago, we're not making progress of instrumental ethics and utilitarian ethics and all those arguments, which actually remain very philosophical and contained in an academic small discussion. And religious ethics, largely led by, I would say, Christian ethicists and social ethicists and so on, have made some progress. But it's why I think we need to really open up language, which you can say religious / ethical and so on. But even I'm not just enamored of ethical language, which is like, you must do this, or even a justice language, you have to do it this way. No, I think what we need to think about is the spectrum of environment as religious, as Anna's just said, the spectrum of religious possibilities that go from creation care, that go from new ideas of not dominion, but a care, et cetera. So all that's being worked out in these traditions, right? But I also think we need trusteeship in Islam. I mean, it's a tremendous term. It's a really very rich term. But I also think, and this comes back to Fletcher's point with indigenous traditions and what happened up in Minnesota, I think we need new language about what we are experiencing as human beings in relation to the natural world. I mean, sorry, Fletcher, Buddhism does have kinship. Buddhism does have a sense of sentience throughout the natural world. Confucianism has a profound sense of the moral dimension of nature. You see, that's what we're missing here. We're like, do we put it back in there? Do we take it from our religious traditions? No, indigenous traditions and certain Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism have a very different sense of this dynamic, vibrant, fecund world in which we live. And I think there's new language to be drawn upon that will appeal to next generation people. And it's also why we did Journey of the Universe, which is not specifically tied to any religion. So anyway, the spectrum within religions and the spectrum beyond religions are, I think, what we need to think about and to offer.
Fletcher, do you want to give your opinion as well?
No, but look, why don't you go? I'm sure you and others have questions. So I liked what Mary Evelyn and Mary Evelyn, I'm totally with you in terms of the teachings are there in all of the religions. But what in my line of work, what I look at is I don't see as many, I see far more indigenous leaders able to speak in a deeply integrated way about this than I see leaders from any of the other traditions. And I think that's the challenge is how do you, and to be honest, some of that is hard won through centuries of suffering. But it's not only that. And you do see for sure beautiful isolated examples of people who capture it. And they are compelling because they've got something that's spectacular and that is also really different.
Yeah, that I couldn't agree more with, because as you say, John, studying it, and we've been very involved with the Crow people and the Salish peoples and so on. And I just want to mention, so I fully agree with that. We've been working for a year on MOOCs, massive open online classes on religion and ecology. And the one on indigenous traditions and ecology is so inspiring for all the reasons that you're saying, Fletcher, because we've interviewed people from every continent. And what's especially exciting is traditional environmental knowledge, TEK, and scientific, biological, ecological knowledge is coming together in restoration projects that are just stunning. People trained, with PhDs now in these areas, restoring wetlands and streams and so on, and fishing areas. So very, very inspiring things are happening with this new confluence of knowledge that's being taken seriously. They're extremely exciting, inspiring.
And I think that may be an interesting sort of response off to what you said about this sort of, ethics piece. I mean, it seemed where I see the ethics emerging most powerfully in places where there's a strong culture around these practices. So again, I mean, it's fascinating one of the under-described aspects of a lot of these big climate mobilizations is that in many of them, the hospitality and the care for the participants is remarkable. I mean, 2 days ago up in Minnesota, people had made hundreds of sandwiches to give to people while they were standing on, the people walking up and down with sunscreen and jugs of water for people and stuff. I mean, that's like in religious communities, that's like called hospitality. That's the hospitality committee. But I mean, it's, so, and here it is lived out largely by millennials, who've most of them grown up outside of an organized religious tradition, but who are building this culture that's really beautiful around this stuff. So it's just sort of interesting about like what's religious and what's not.
Thank you so much for your reflections. I had a much simpler question, maybe not simpler, but like less long. But I was wondering, because as your presentations showed, there's many different ways of understanding the role of humans, but also the place of humans in nature. And given that you work, both Mary Evelyn and Fletcher, and I think Anna as well, because in Indonesia there's so much diversity, in contexts where there's a lot of interfaith dialogue, how do you talk about such a thing as nature when we have such a different conceptualization of what that is and what is our relationship to it within those coalitions and within those kind of groups? Yes, maybe we can start with Fletcher.
A couple of brief thoughts. One of the things is I think that, the religious environmental movement has given the interfaith movement a really important sort of pathway into the next step in its evolution, because I think that, the first several generations of interfaith work were understandably, in addition to really good peace building work that groups such as Religions for Peace have done and many, many others. A lot of interfaith work was focused on interfaith dialogue, where there was an exchange of ideas and a sort of establishment of essential similarities in certain ways. I think that one of the advantages of religious environmental multi-faith sort of conversation is that up until recently, nobody in religions knew what the heck their religion taught about the environment. I mean, nobody'd read the good books from Harvard and stuff like that. So there was this wonderful lack of knowledge, which brought with it an openness and a naivete that was really helpful. So I think there's a genuine, like, just curiosity about, when Muslims learn, or non-Muslims learn that, that the natural world, that it's referred to as an ayat, a sign of the sacred or a sign of the divine, along, just like the Quran is referred to in that way. That's really, it's an interesting idea, and I think that religion gets a big leg up when its ideas are presented in interesting ways, as opposed to moralistic or, dull, repetitive ways. So I think that's one piece. And then I think also there was a wonderful phrase by a guy named Millard Fuller, who started an affordable housing thing called Habitat for Humanity that spread internationally. And he talked about the theology of the hammer, that, that when people get together and have to build a house together, that there's commonality through action. And I think that we see that with the public actions that we do, that there's something that's really powerful when you've got Muslims and Hindus and Jews and Christians sort of linking arms, walking together in a public action. That's very powerful.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to contribute as well? Go on, Anna.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it, Safa. Thank you. I don't study interfaith movements. That's a whole thing. Yeah, but I think that in the spirit of what Fletcher was saying as well, I don't think incommensurability is like the problem in those spaces from what I've observed academically, in Indonesia and elsewhere. I think really I just would have two things to say in response to your excellent question. So the question, as I heard it, was, how do you communicate a nature concept if that doesn't mean the same thing, right? If that's not received or communicated in the same way across boundaries of difference. And, again, it's like I don't use nature concepts in my work, quite self-consciously so, about Islam. And I'm very aware also of the received discourses around environment and environmentalism. I teach them now as my job in environmental humanities. And in an interfaith context, I think that notions such as stewardship as imposed from a biblical kind of a framework onto the Quran actually can end up erasing a lot of what is in Islamic tradition and what people actually use naturally as a vocabulary to talk about their relationship with resources of the natural world, or whatever you want to call environment. What I think also is the second point is in a way, it's kind of like what Fletcher was saying, but it's a little different. It comes from my academic grounding much more than an activist stance. But I think that really, to get at what I feel like is the heart of your question, Sandra, like how can people talk together and be on the same page? I actually think that having more clarity and more thoughtfulness around what is environment and environmental sciences and environmental studies, and articulating environmental challenges beyond this sort of ethical but unexplored language of sustainability and justice, I think that could help a lot in terms of connecting people to real struggles and people and places and their own commitment. So, but that's just saying that what I do, I hope is meaningful, right, as someone in that field. But thank you for that great question. I wonder what Mary Evelyn has to say.
Thanks, Anna. I'm sure what you do is very meaningful. And just to pick up on both of your responses, I was involved in interreligious dialogue for a long, long time, and living in Japan for 3 years at different points, created some dialogues with Buddhists and Shinto and Confucians and so on, which was very unusual in that context. But I do want to say that and one of the oldest interreligious dialogues was the Buddhist-Christian one with Masao Abe from Japan and John Cobb, great process theologian, and so on. And that went on for many years. It was extraordinary. And there's a whole journal on it, et cetera. And my grandfather was a founder. He was a professor at Columbia, founder of National Conference of Christian and Jews, which was trying to improve understandings and relationships. So I'm very devoted to interreligious dialogue per se, but I do agree with Fletcher. I mean, I used to say, okay, after we've said you're a theist, I'm an atheist, and the Buddhist Christian, or whatever, let's get on to what is actually happening and deeper dialogue, which did happen for sure in the Buddhist Christian dialogue and so on. But I think, we need to, I used to say years ago that our common sensibility, which Fletcher noted here, where is the common ground? For example, in the Middle East, to say if the religions don't come together around water, around the Jordan River, around essential life, almost everything else is going to be secondary. And that's what EcoPeace Middle East is trying to do, bring the religions together. And Gideon Bromberg is doing amazing work in that regard, absolutely amazing. But I guess I just want to say that we need to do a lot more, because if we realize that the Catholic Church in Vatican, Second Vatican II, it only said in 1962 with Nostra Aetate, there was truth in other religions. Thomas Berry used to say, not just truth, they had this expression, there's light in other religions. Thomas Berry would say, there's rays of light in all the world's religions. But think how recent that is. It's 60 years. So we have a long way to go in terms of interreligious dialogue, as we know. But if we can say our common future is a shared future, that opens up lots of possibilities, I think. And Anna, Indonesia is a great example, and love to hear more from you, maybe in another time, of what is Pancasila and what does this mean to have that in the constitution of the religions coming together. But Safa, more questions.
One other piece on this particular question. I think there's one factor that none of us have mentioned, is that there's a level at which consumer capitalism is as close to a universal global religion in the sense of system of meaning that exists. Its power is unparalleled, and that's one of the reasons that the forces that I think that any kind of interfaith sort of reckoning now needs to take that into account also, because the claims of that system of meaning run counter to the claims of all of the previously established religions at many levels.
Thank you so much. I'll have just one more question for myself, and then I'll move to the questions from the audience. But Mary Evelyn, you opened your book Ecology and Religion on synergies and challenges, promises and problems, right? And talking about how religions can run counter to environmental preservation, but also you mentioned the fact that, for example, the notion of the environment changed over time in Christian Europe, and with imports from other traditions, but also like different sociopolitical contexts as well. And so kind of going back to what Fletcher was saying earlier about the Methodist Church or the right-wing kind of groups in the United States, and kind of the overlap with religious identity as well. I was wondering how, if you could maybe provide some examples of groups that you've worked with that maybe initially had very much kind of resisting ideas of humans' intervention to protect the environment, or the agency of humans to determine their own life, for example, and how maybe that changed through dialogue with other denominations, or maybe within their own tradition. So I was wondering if you could, yeah.
Well, that's a great question, and I hope my colleagues here will also respond. I think the one example comes to mind of the evangelical Christians in this country, and there's a film, I'll have to get the title for you later, but that's been made along these lines of, okay, how can dialogue and experience change people's minds? All right, so dialogue is one thing, but the experience of climate change, for example, And this film makes it very, very clear in this case of a woman from the Midwest who didn't believe in climate change and so on, and her house got flooded, and she began to connect the dots. And I think what we're not doing is connecting the dots of, well, in this country, clearly, because of so much false information and denial and so on, which is, you know, deeply, deeply troubling, to put it mildly. But as we can break through, and people like Katharine Hayhoe, the evangelical scientist, has really helped in that regard. So I think dialogue and experience are absolutely necessary. But, you know, Anna's mentioned, and I'm glad she did, she's at this wonderful Nelson Institute at University of Wisconsin, and I'm at the School of the Environment at Yale, and so we both know the science-based environment that, again, has its problems and promise, okay? And that I think we need to also work with scientists to say, don't just be instrumental about the religions. I mean, I've had Ed Wilson, a wonderful Harvard scientist, come on board during the Harvard conferences. And he's like, Mary Evelyn, just bring these religious people on board. And I'm like, we need some respect. We need some understanding of where they're coming from too. And I love the, you know, these scientists. But so in both cases, we need dialogue, experience, and understanding with the scientists and then with people from the various religions. A lot more to be said. It's such a good question.
Thank you. I think we'll move to the audience questions, because although I would love to see your contributions as well, Fletcher and Anna, I'm sorry. So we have a question from the ONAGS member. So do you think that the publication Laudato Si is having tangible impacts within and outside the religious sphere? Maybe we can start with Anna, if you want, or Fletcher.
Oh, I don't know. I don't have much to say. I want to hear what other people have to say. I know that Muslims took Laudato Si as an invitation to deliver similar sort of declarations, like the International Declaration on Climate Change. But yeah, I'm curious. You know, others have worked much more in that area, both with respect to Christian faith communities as well as the sort of this proclamation kind of mode of discourse.
Yes, maybe we can hear from Fletcher then.
Sure. Yeah, no, there's no question. I mean, I think it's important on two levels. First of all, it's a first-rate document. So the thought leadership, cultural leadership, moral leadership in terms of the language in the document is something that you know, if you're serious, you got to reckon with it. It's not a religious puff piece. It's really, really remarkable. But then the other thing that's important about it is that Pope Francis has committed to institutionalizing it. So, and this is alongside really good work by the Global Catholic Climate Movement, is now sort of creating implementation plans to get the Catholic Church institutionally to take advantage of its centralized structure and to roll out something that is going to reach to the corners of the Catholic Church. And to me, I think, you know, it's extremely rare with religious statements that there are a lot of really good, well-written religious statements, and those are important. They do play an important role. The ones that go to or that explicitly link themselves to an implementation plan are few and far between. And I think that's, again, from my stance, you know, we could do with, on the activist front, we could do with a fewer number of statements and more people sort of getting out of the pews, off the prayer rugs, into the streets, so to speak. And I think that when religious groups use statements as the be all and end all, that's problematic. It's important at first, and then it's important as a reinforcing function, but it's got to get linked with action.
Yeah, if I could just jump in here. Thank you for the question. It's so important. And I happen to come from a Catholic social justice background, and I'm on this committee involved with Laudato Si from the dicastery in the Vatican of Human Development. And, you know, it's quite amazing to me, especially around the world, the response here. And Iyad Abu Mogli, who's head of the Faith for Earth at UNEP, is working on a new document with many Muslims, Mizan, balance and so on in response to this. And all the world's religions have made a response to it. But just to pick up on what Fletcher's saying, you know, for better or for worse, talk about problems and promise, the Catholic Church with its outreach and institutional structures has unbelievable potential here. And what's very striking is how young people have picked this up. Just 2 weeks ago was the 6th anniversary of it coming out, and the whole week there were webinars on education, on liturgy, on divestment. There were thousands of people listening to these webinars from all over the world. The Pope made a statement at the end of the beginning of the week and at the end of the week and so on. And then they launched at the end of the week a 7-year action plan, which is going to be refined over the next few months, and then even more launched in October, I just read today. And people are giving feedback on this. It's remarkable how the religious groups, the priests and nuns, the Jesuits are putting this into all of their educational system. It's the largest educational system in the world. So I think that the potential is extraordinary. And the Pope, fortunately, is a figure who's respected by and large and loved for his humility and so on. So there's great, I think there's great hope and great promise, certainly with Laudato Si.
Thank you so much. We have another question that's relating to what Fletcher said earlier about indigenous spiritual terms being used by secular actors. They say, can't using indigenous and religious thinking for development be viewed as purely instrumental? What about symbol appropriation? Is it still a step in the right direction, or can it cause new problems?
It can definitely cause new problems. I mean, I think if you're from a dominant culture in any place and you do sort of symbolic appropriation without going through pretty challenging searching engagement with indigenous communities wherever you are, then you've got no business doing the appropriation. I mean, you know, unless you're engaging with those communities, and unless you're seeking to elevate voices from within those communities, then you've, from our perspective, got no business messing around with using the language. It's highly disrespectful.
Yeah. So there is another question about, I think what Anna was mentioning in the Quran, and the fact that the Day of Judgment is mentioned very often. So there was some mention of the world to come. Would some religious people see the climate crisis as a prelude rather than a problem to resolve?
That's a good question. I hear that sometimes here, especially you know, in the United States, where correctly or incorrectly there's a perception that some Protestant teachings about the eschatology actually suppress or diminish a kind of motivation to environmental engagement. So I'm familiar with a kind of, I'm not sure exactly what the question was, but I've heard one like that a lot. What I can say, assuming that that's the spirit of the question, they're not, you know, sort of reporting on what the Quran says or something like that, is what I found in my field work, so just speaking empirically now, right, is that on the contrary, that the awareness of this horizon of consequence, as I was calling it in the language of the presentation, or, you know, or ultimate judgment, in fact, redoubled commitment to engagement in this world. Because there were consequences to come, and because of the calculation based on hadith, based on authoritative teachings as people presented them, that a way to attempt to obtain God's mercy, to achieve literally the landscape and the world to come that's desired, right, which is the garden and not the fire, comes by practicing mercy to God's creation. So if I heard the question right, the answer is like, no, actually having a strongly eschatological worldview actually led people to think about these consequences and relations in a way that I saw empirically enhanced environmental commitment. It's also interesting, and one of the reasons why it was so important for me to sort through this question then about global messages that circulate, about nature or in Anglophone systems or whatever, and then what was also arising organically, what I heard in the field and what I read in other non-English, non-European languages, is that that's something I never saw before in discussions, at least in North American English, about Islam and the environment, right? There wasn't a lot that was written about the Quran being largely about, the Day of Judgment. And, I wrote a book on Quran and I think about it all the time. And I'm not surprised at all then that teaching about these relations, both horizontal and vertical relations, are against the horizon of judgment. And that's a very, in a sense, a very like positive environmental teaching, if you will. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. So there's a very long question, sorry. There are so many critics on the impact of industrialization and capitalism on the environment and human relationship with it. And some argue that the former also were necessary solutions to other problems, including starvation, poverty, and very short life expectancy of modern pre-industrial world. They counter the former critic as mere romanticization of pre-industrial life. In reality, pre-industrial in reality, for industrial peoples, rather than enjoying this religious ethics-based mode of existence, were just constrained logistically in what they're capable of in the first place. So I suppose the audience member wants your thought on this dichotomy. Yeah.
I don't know that anybody here is idealizing pre-industrial life. I think that what we're saying, or for sure what I'm saying, is that we've got an economy that it's been clear for 50 plus years is destroying the planet. And there've been a lot of alternative pathways that could have continued to increase human prosperity without destroying the atmosphere, the water, the soil. And because of moral decisions that business and governmental leaders made, those more beneficial pathways weren't followed. And so now we're up against it. So I don't think that it's a question of, history goes forward, it doesn't go backwards. But these choices matter. And capitalism, the way that, from our perspective at Green Faith, capitalism, the way that it's practiced now is entirely incompatible with a sustainable future. That doesn't mean that there aren't forms of it that can emerge, but the dominant form is not close to being sustainable.
If I could just quickly build on that, thank you, Fletcher. It's a complicated question, clearly, but I think what is happening and what's I think happening with great force and speed is the unraveling of certain dimensions of capitalism and the emergence of a range of regenerative capitalism to new systems thinking, which is what our former Dean Gus Speth is working on, really new economic systems. But I think one of the areas where the religious communities, and Fletcher, it's been very active, is this divestment movement, started by Bill McKibben and many others, but $14 trillion of divestment of oil and gas and so on, 25%, if not a little more, maybe 30%, are from religious communities who started corporate social responsibility years ago. And there's an interfaith center for that in the New York area. So I think that religious communities understand, and especially as Anna's raised the point of environmental justice and equity and so on, that this is one of the things that religious communities can really contribute. And I'll just conclude by saying my brother is head of Chubb Insurance in New York, and the insurance industry has got to be called out even more. He's a complete supporter of the divestment and so on. And so is the CEO of Chubb, who says, we are in an existential threat. We can't afford to insure California and other scorched areas. So all of these insurance industries know they're losing their shirts. And between the banking and financial industries and the insurance industries, the ground is shifting. This is the basis of capitalism. It is completely shifting before our eyes. And that's, I think, an exciting thing. And the religious communities have a very important role to play there, as they are, with Fletcher and other help.
Thank you so much to Anna, Fletcher, and Mary Evelyn. I think we will bring the event to a close right now. I would like also to flag out next week's event. It's going to be on Monday. And actually, Mary Evelyn, you gave me a great transition. It's about climate finance and how to unlock and enable private capital for climate mitigation and adaptation projects. For just an idea, private capital only represents about 2% of climate adaptation finance currently. And we will welcome Sean Kidney, the CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative, and Professor Nick Robbins, co-founder of Carbon Tracker and professor at the Grantham Research Institute of the London School of Economics, to speak on this issue. And so we hope to see you then. And I will stop the live stream.